And we are live with Sitrep episode 2, an update on the situation going on in the mafia state of Ukraine. Uh, Lots of things going on. We have mobilization, we have offensive in Kherson, we have Western leaders virtue signaling about tanks as well. Before I do that, I am joined by these wonderful gentlemen. I will go right from left. How are you all doing today? Go ahead and introduce yourselves.
I'm doing very well, thank you.
I'm doing well as well, thank you.
I'm doing absolutely fan-fucking-tastic. Thank you for having me on.
It was my pleasure. So let's discuss the main thing that happened, and that was the Kharkov offensive, which was a moral blow for the Russians, losing territory that supposedly you're going to keep for the last man, and then abandoning it. So, Mandrill, I'm going to let you kind of take the lead on this since you are more aware of this. What's actually going on in Kharkov situation?
Honestly, I haven't really paid attention to Kharkov. I've mostly focused my efforts on the mobilization and weapons and stuff. So unfortunately, I can't give you a huge sit rep on the exact precise tactical situation there.
All right, from what I've understood from the situation, which is limited, essentially the area was lightly defended by militiamen of the DPR and LPR, if that. And so it isn't a surprise that 5,000 professionally trained troops retook the entire region essentially without a fight. Because it was essentially abandoned, mostly because those troops were strategically relocated to Zaporizhia and Kherson, which were the main areas that the Russians actually cared about. They seemed to be less focused on Kharkov and more focused on Bakhmut and central Donetsk, and of course protecting Kherson region at the moment as their main priority. As well as the mobilization. So, with this recent strategic embarrassment in Kharkov, Putin recently mobilized 300,000 reservists. So, what are the implications of that?
Well, the implications, I think, before Praise of Folly hops in, the implications, I think, of Russia trying to attempt a partial mobilization, I honestly think it's a bit too little too late. I think it's Russia realizing that they should have committed more in the earlier months quicker, and they're trying to make up for lost time, and they're just not going to be able to do it quick enough, I honestly think. And the implications of it, I think, are Russia very much feels the pressure, feels like the clock is running out, and they're trying their damnedest to come out of this with at least a somewhat semblance of a geopolitical victory, because the consequences of abandoning the Kharkiv front, even if it was lightly defended by militiamen, the consequences of abandoning an entire front like the Kharkiv front. Apparently, the lieutenant general in charge of that front was captured during the operations there. Is that Russia is basically, as I've said on Thomas's podcast, which came out a couple of days ago about his own little update of the situation. Russia has abandoned its secondary and tertiary geopolitical objectives, being the coastline of all the way over to Odessa, and then all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper as the secondary and tertiary geopolitical objectives. The primary geopolitical objective being the ensuring the independence or absorption of Novorossiya, the Donbass, and Crimea, which I still think they can achieve if they're able to squeeze a settlement out of the West, but Lord knows. And so that's kind of my take on the whole thing. I've been talking for a little while, so I'm gonna let someone else speak.
Right. So the Russian mobilization from the official Russian side figures is about 300,000 men, and these are men that have prior military experience, so they shouldn't take as long to deploy to the front as straight up, conscripts with no prior military experience. The other aspect is, I think, what a lot of people initially thought was that because Russia was from like December of 2021 to like February of 2022, there was a lot of discussion about Russia being the second most powerful military in the world, comparison to Russia, U.S., and China. And I think a lot of people expected Russia, including myself, to do better in the opening days of the campaign. Partly, I think, because we expected they'd deploy more troops. This seems to be a larger scale mistake on par with the U.S. surge in Iraq. We didn't bring in enough troops to hold down from insurgents. Now, that's quite different than active duty conventional forces of the Ukrainians. But these extra troops that are being called up, I think what that represents is that the distance, I think, from what they have in Kherson in the far south to like the Donbass is like 1,000 kilometers. Ukraine is huge. It's the largest country in Europe after Russia. And I think what they're beginning to realize is they need more troops to hold what they have as well as to push forward. Because at 250,000, I mean, I think the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 with the coalition of the willing of 250,000. But no, it was 150,000. So, but yeah, Ukraine is far larger than Iraq. And I think on a broader meta scale, it's sort of a repetition of the similar mistaken thinking that you could get by with less, because holding territory still needs men.
Yes, I totally agree. A major weakness of the Russian advance to start with, especially in the northeast, when we were all talking about Chernihiv and Sumy and the area north of Kharkiv, all of that area the Russians couldn't hold with their tank army that they had up there, the armored thrust that they were basically driving along the two parallel roads towards Kiev. They couldn't hold the ground there because they just didn't have enough infantry where they could, secure the ground behind them. So, that was one of the mistakes that they made, which ultimately caused them to pull out, in April and May. So I think this is a better step forward, and any sort of like mobilization that continues is probably going to help their situation on the ground, just from a resources perspective.
Yeah, I probably would hope to avoid embarrassments like abandoning an entire region because you only have militiamen who, although have fought for like 8 years, aren't exactly the best professionals. And as we saw, with just like 5,000 men, easily broke down and retreated, abandoning territory, which was a morale victory for Ukraine. Let's not forget. So that's probably most likely why as well. Also, securing supply lines is very important. Something that you mentioned earlier was that we really saw in the very beginning of this conflict was that their supply columns were getting hit in the rear because they didn't secure them. And so that's why there was so many armored vehicles and supply trucks being blown up. They didn't secure their supply lines, and so they were kind of forced to abandon the northern offensives in Kiev, Sumy, Chernihiv. So the main focus has been redirected, as far as I can tell currently, Bakhmut. Central Donetsk is where the current professional troops are forcibly being funneled as the main point of the offensive right now. And I can't really see another direction, maybe besides Kherson, but that area seems to just be a defensive. I see the Donbass as the main area of offense only at the moment.
Yes, on the side of the Russians.
Yeah.
I think broadly too, what needs to be said about the Ukrainian defensive strategy. Now, this is from the Russian perspective, but I think it's technically correct still. They claim that Ukraine is using the German World War II concept of Festung cities or fortress cities. So obviously Kiev, Mariupol, Kharkiv, Kherson would be designated as these fortress cities. And of course, Kharkiv and Kiev were defended successfully. Mariupol took months to fall, and Kherson fell, I think, probably the quickest out of all of them. But what it does is it negates armored penetrating thrusts and force the Russians to commit to these street-by-street battles. We saw something like that as well a few months ago in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And it's a way to negate armored power. I mean, this is something that I remember once a couple of years ago when I did a stream with Keith Preston on how an anarchist society to defend itself. I mentioned, well, they could use cities as, traps like, Grozny in 95 or, some of these World War II killing zones like Stalingrad. And it seems that Ukraine is intentionally doing that. And it seems to be working to a point.
It definitely does, as for discouraging them from focusing on the urban areas. They seem to be more or less focusing on the smaller urban areas and the more outlying suburbs at the moment, unless like they have to fight for them, like in Donbass right now.
Right, but this comes down to the manpower strategy. Russia just doesn't have the manpower with the 250,000 men they've got in Ukraine right now to conquer big cities. And so what the Ukrainians can effectively do is, I can put two relatively close together towns, build a defensive position in between them, and just chain link these things and make a defensive line. It's not that hard to do that. So it's just the Russians need more men, and they always needed more men. And now that they're going to give themselves more men, what now? And that's the question. I think that we were talking before the stream, and we mentioned that the one thing that Russia could do with its manpower is a sort of winter offensive. So the 300,000 men that Putin has announced are going to be conscripted back into service, who have prior military experience, supposedly. They are going to take some time to reassemble and give new training and to re-equip. So I'm going to assume that that's probably going to take them a minimum of 3 months. It's already almost October. And if you take just 3 months, that means that you're going to have probably a January offensive movement. Now, in the announcement with the 300,000 conscription notice that he gave, there's also another announcement, which was that they were also increasing the size of their active duty armed forces by 137,000. So if you think, okay, so that's going to give them roughly 450,000 men almost. If they have another 200 to 250,000 men in Ukraine already, well, that should give them roughly 750,000 men. So that should be enough for their purposes. And, considering the Ukrainians have about, roughly the same 200 to 300,000, that's, a lopsided fight. Now, of course, the Ukrainians are at general mobilization and have been so since, this thing kicked off back in February. It just means, eventually attrition is going to take its toll, and who's going to run out of weapons first. I think from Putin's perspective, the strategic play that he can do here is to make this winter offensive starting in January, when the West is sufficiently weakened by its sanctions efforts, economically, I mean, and is also feeling the pain from a couple months of lack of winter heating and high energy prices. This matters because what he wants on the ground in Ukraine is to prevent Western powers from continuing to dump weapons into Ukraine, especially the more modern ones. Already, you have seen many different nations putting, and even more recent ones, increasing nations giving weapons to Ukraine, but most of it's just been old Soviet kit from the Eastern European countries. There is a program that Germany has made called Ringtausch, which is where Germans have promised to give modern German military equipment in exchange for other nations to give their Soviet kit to Ukraine. And some other nations like Greece and Slovenia have taken advantage of that. But a lot of this has just been donations, right? So Slovakia, Czechia, I think Poland was talking about it. All of these countries have decided to donate their Cold War era military heavy hardware to Ukraine. And now that all of that stuff has been done, the next logical step is to start giving actual Western military hardware to Ukraine. And so what Putin wants right now that Ukraine has all of this, surplus military hardware, is to make sure that he doesn't have to fight the new Western stuff. Well, how is he going to do that? Well, his best possible move is to make sure that Europe is economically hurting at the same time as he is making offensive action in Ukraine with a superior military force. So both Ukraine is weakened militarily and having to fight a numerically superior Russian army, and Europe is unwilling to offer additional aid, which will come increasingly at their expense. That isn't just something lying in storage that they weren't already planning on using or replacing in the next 10 years. So that's what I think he'll do.
The other thing is, given one of the stated reasons for the partial mobilization was that there was all of these NATO. He says we're basically fighting NATO because NATO's giving all these weapons to Ukraine. I think Russia badly miscalculated how much NATO would give Ukraine, because it's pretty clear that early on the man pads were effective, like the Stinger against Russian helicopters, and the shorter launched anti-tank missiles like the Javelin and NLAW were effective against tanks. Now, it's true that a lot of that kit's been used up, and the stores are very heavily depleted in the Western powers. I think we actually mentioned this last time we had a stream, but in order to prevent
we did.
In order to prevent them from making any more, they definitely would like to see that go away. And I think that we're kind of in what you're describing, Raging Mandrill, is what I would call like the Sitzkrieg. And right after Hitler invaded Poland, it was 6 to 9 months before things heated up again, because the Germans, admittedly, they were wildly successful, but they had to reorganize and reorient everything. I think Russia's in a similar decision, because they have to reorganize because they underdeployed the amount of troops and underestimated the amount of aid Ukraine would get.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know if the war will last long enough for it to heat up again, because one of the most under talked about things in terms of modern warfare, something that myself and Mandrill in our long conversations about military theory have often hit upon, is the idea of economics being the largest force of modern warfare. And that, quite frankly, what happens if you try to fight a 20th century mass conventional war with armored vehicles, air-land breakthrough, what we renamed from blitzkrieg to shock and awe. Like, if you try to fight that in the 21st century, it's just not going to work for you unless you're willing to do what the U.S. government did in Desert Storm in '93, which is basically get a coalition of the entire world, bomb the shit out of the country for 48 hours, and then take over a pile of rubble. Like that's the only way for you to fight a conventional war, and it's really strategically limited. And what you're seeing now is, like, you see two armies, particularly very almost exclusively so, two armies based around armored combat, because that's the Slavic military doctrine. That's generally what they focus on, is armored breakthrough, armored combat. And what you're seeing is, in the current era, how that kind of flounders after a couple of weeks, not even considering months of shoveling resources into this endless resource dump that is armored warfare. And I think Ukraine, the Ukrainian military, because it's literally entirely run by United States High Command. Like, that's not even a secret. Like, we run everything for them. The Ukrainian military has kind of changed itself somewhat to better suit that goal. And in addition, well, they have taken a severe amount of casualties, which I don't want to understate. They have taken a severe amount of casualties. Time is on their side. Time is on the side of the defenders always in warfare. Because Russia, as our good friend Charlemagne said in an article recently, Russia can't outspend the West, and they're finding that out now. So a lot of what Russia's actions are just, too little, too late. I mean, they're not coming off of some grand operational success. I mean, unless you could count Syria as an operational success, but last time I checked, it's still going on. They're not coming off of some grand operational success that they're then using the momentum to shift into this immediate second warfare. Matter of fact, their abandonment of the Kharkiv front, even if it was a strategically sound decision, morally, or not morally, in terms of morale, not morally, it has probably greatly dampened the view of the war in Russia. I mean, I don't want to believe U.S. propaganda too much, but I've been hearing that there are mass protests against this sort of drafting within Russia. Whether those are astroturfed or not, they are happening, and even astroturf protests can easily lead to something else. So the point is that I guess the final point, just to kind of bring this monologue to a close, Russia can't outspend the West. Time is on the side of the defenders. Russia basically needs to take a couple of cities to secure the Donbass if they want to hold it throughout the winter, and then maybe push for something in the spring if they can even last that long and get their mobilized troops in place. Otherwise, they'll just kind of start crumbling under the weight of the cost of resources, and the West, having expended comparatively very little resources and very much having the capacity to replace it, will just kind of sit idly by while Russia leads itself to its own demise.
A couple of points to add. One part in favor of what Paul's saying is that the 1991 war against Iraq was already against a nation that had bled itself dry in 10 years fighting Iran. And then the 2003 invasion was a country that had been sanctioned for 12 years. So Iraq was already kind of crippled when the United States threw down what Ukraine was. I guess it was already kind of a basket case in the first place. So I guess that's a area where I think Paul has a point. But I think the other area, though, is back to economics. Yes, it is all about economics. It's about energy. And Europe's about to take it up the backside. And that's what the real question is. As well,
Yeah.
food.
And if you're looking at the markets today, things don't really look good for you. The United States right now either. The stock market took a pretty big hit just this afternoon. So I mean, we'll see where that goes. The bond yields, something's going on with them. But the problem with the West outspending Russia is you have the problem of fiat currency, right? If you can simply inflate your way to victory, and just we'll just print more dollars, and that equals more tanks and more guns. Okay, that works for you, but we're already in a position where the Federal Reserve has to increase its interest rates, which is part of the reason why we're now in a technical recession. So it's going to get worse because the Fed had to raise its rates again, and the housing market is now slowing down. So this is what I mean when I say that Putin actually has to make action that is coordinated with other things in the world. And if we're talking about economics, he has to make his military attack when the West is economically not going to be in a position of strength where the logical calculus will be to just endlessly supply Ukraine with weapons, and especially the more modern Western weapons that the mainstream sources want to give Ukraine, like the Leopard 2. Like I was literally watching a stream that Deutsche Welle was putting out this afternoon, and they were talking about how they wanted to give the Leopard 2 to Ukraine. So that's quite a different weapons system than just giving them Mark 1 T-72s that the Czechs and the Slovenes and Poland might give them. So he does have options, and even if he's not going to take all of Ukraine, or even what I thought was going to be the most likely scenario, which is he was going to take everything east of the Dnieper and Odessa, he can still come away with this with a strategic victory. And that strategic victory will be, okay, I took the Donbass and Zaporozhye and the Crimea regions up to Kherson. And that's going to be his condition for victory at this point, I think.
No, yeah, I completely agree with that. And I completely agree that is possible. It is possible, and I said that in one of my earlier monologues, it is possible for Russia to force a settlement with the West to gain the Donbass, Crimea, Novorossiya. And that would, but like, I kind of want to reemphasize, I think that's the best that they can expect at this point, because while yes, I do agree with you that the United States and Europe, United States less so than Europe, is about to undergo a very difficult winter in terms of energy costs. The United States can probably take it on the chin a bit better than Russia can, just in terms of comparing the strength of the two economies. And while I don't know if Russia will necessarily implode, you'll probably, maybe definitely after this war, the question of Putin's leadership, depending on how quickly he can deliver them a victory, will very much be a thing on the minds of many people. Because I don't think they're going to replace him during the war, but they might replace him afterwards. I don't think that will lead to Russia's collapse of a nation state. And yeah, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm being an apologist for the United States or for anything like that. It's just, it's just I have to call it like I see it. But yeah, no, yeah, that's a pretty fair and decent analysis of the situation. One thing I want to draw attention to that, not a lot of people have been drawing attention to is what a possible tumultuous China situation, which we're finding out could happen today, would have what effect that would have on this conflict, if any, if China just all of a sudden goes belly up, because with what we're hearing coming out of China, it might happen.
So as far as I don't remember if I mentioned this is my grand strategy theory for Russia and China, but I'll mention it again anyhow. Putin met with Xi, like I think in December of 2021 or January of 2022, right before the invasion of Ukraine. And I think that this is a bit of a stretch, but I think you can make the case that Russia is sort of China's cat's paw, or Russia is sort of baiting out the West to get committed to Europe, to support Ukraine, to get all these military assets organized to Ukraine, and then wait to see what the winter holds, because I think China is as interested in that as Russia is. And then using that at some point to initiate pressure on Taiwan. Firstly, a blockade. Those war games in August, the way China wants to rationalize it is, well, we have a one China policy in the UN. I mean, what's wrong, guys? We're just doing a war games in our own territory. Of course, what it actually means is it threatens international semiconductor supplies, which means if you lose that, you don't have advanced guidance systems, and then that's it. All the smart weapons go bye-bye if you used them all up in other parts of the world. And I think it's kind of a cat's paw maneuver we're looking at. It's a possibility.
It's interesting hearing that chatter about China, because that Deutsche Welle stream that I was listening to earlier, that mainstream source, was talking about how like China and India might be separated from Russia and how they're not happy. So that's an interesting angle, hearing that from the mainstream.
That was definitely very interesting. We'll have to see what's going on in the situation. I have heard that apparently trains were canceled as well as flights domestically, although I'm not quite sure what's going on in the situation there. However, if I had to guess, if what actually happened is Xi was actually replaced, it would be an inter-power struggle within the CCP, maybe a rogue faction of the Xi Jinping variety, but it's quite difficult to say if he was actually replaced, because he is a very shrewd politician. Xi is. But I wanted to mention this before we move on to China. Hunger brought up another interesting question. Is there any risk of Ukrainian defections as a result of the referendums in Novorossiya? How do the referendums affect the rest of Ukraine? And if I had to guess, it doesn't really affect Ukraine because those territories are already, the people left are pro-Russian anyway. It's only the signals to the Russian base, Putin's base, that okay, these territories are officially Russian, so therefore support us sending more Russian troops there, because these are part of the homeland. But what do you think, Praisefoli? Do you think this is going to affect Ukraine in a major way?
I think by this point, the people that were pro-Russia in the East are mostly under Russian control already, and those that are pro-Ukrainian, especially since they have fled from Novorossiya into the still Ukrainian-controlled areas would probably be enough of an electoral deterrent to prevent any sort of like coup of the pro-Russians, especially if what we've heard is true, that pro-Russian supporters in Kharkov are getting tortured and shot. I think this whole conflict is going to sort people out already. If you're pro-Russian, you're going to haul ass to where the Russians are, and if you're pro-Ukrainian, you're going to haul ass the other way. So I think at that point, the diplomatic measures, it's not going to be like, say, in 1861 in the United States, where there's a real possibility that Maryland and Kentucky and Arkansas would join the Confederacy, or Missouri rather, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, and they actually had to send in troops to stop that. I don't think Ukraine will have to do that because a lot of that's already been sussed out, I think.
Yeah, I would agree.
That's true.
So the population's already sorted themselves based on if they're pro or anti-Russian, as of currently right now. However, another thing this might allow them to do is actually take the gloves off, if you know what I mean, in terms of actually targeting civilian infrastructure in Donbass. If they actually are serious about taking the whole of Donbass, which if they are, they have to use actual force to strike the enemy. And it doesn't matter if it's near civilian infrastructure if you want to win. And again, Putin has said this about Crimea. If the Ukrainians strike Crimea or bases, we're going to attack decision-making centers, and nothing ever happened. And the Ukrainians have attacked Belgorod in Russia as well with missiles. So this might let him, because that these territories will be officially Russian, that the use of force will be more acceptable to the Russian public.
Yeah, this is Putin attempting to secure a de jure sort of a de jure casus belli wouldn't be the correct word, but something in that vein. This is basically him making his invasion de jure, and now all of these states officially within Russian law exist within the Russian framework, and that has a lot more power than people think it does.
Yes.
And I think that's absolutely necessary. I wish he would have done something like it sooner. In all honesty, like my general critiques always just fall on the line of Russia didn't commit enough fast enough to do it. But we'll see if they can we'll see if this gives them enough de jure backing for the Russian public to accept further mobilization, more so than the reservists that were called up, because I think it's going to take more than those reservists to squeeze this one out.
Because what's interesting
Right,
about that,
and that's and that's why I highlighted the 137,000 addition to the Russian regular army as well, Paul. Not just that 300,000 partial mobilization. So they are not just expanding the conscript forces, but they're also expanding their regular army on top of that. So we'll see where that leads. But the language for the legal documentation that's been passed in the Duma has language in it apparently that allows for expansion into a more close version of full mobilization or a full mobilization. So we'll see where that goes. So you're correct that the legal architecture for this is now rolling. So if they want to pull that trigger and go into full mobilization, they could if they wanted to.
Well, what's interesting here is, right, this has been the ambiguous game that began with Crimea in 2014, is the distinction between de facto and de jure control, right? So Russia has a lot of de facto control, and the rest of the Western world has to just deal with that. Now, of course, the de jure control that Russia has, which means the right to control, that Russia's trying to get. I don't think this is for Western consumption. I think this is for two groups. One, it's for Russian citizens themselves. Two, it's for the broader other UN structure, because I feel like that Russia and China, who are both Security Council members, are trying to gain global support within the UN to isolate the West. And so if you can sell it to them and say that, look, this is all just a Western conspiracy, they should have just stayed out of Ukraine in 2014. They're not doing this for the benefit of people in Berlin, Paris, London, or Washington. They're doing it for the benefit of people in, New Delhi or, Riyadh or Cairo or elsewhere in these other, UN nations. And so, because the question is with de jure and de facto, it's always who can back it up, right? Because on the one hand, it's going back to America in 1861, the Confederacy claimed it was, de jure independent. And then the U.S. said, this is ours. And it ultimately was a force of arms that decided it. And the rest of the world just had to accept whatever that force of arms demonstrated. And so what the Confederacy tried to achieve was de jure recognition from Britain and France, and wasn't able to get it, which if they had would have prevented the Union from going any further or made it much more difficult for them to do so. And so I think it's a more of a global opinion that Russia's trying to sway in order to make China and Russia to make some move at the UN either this year or next year.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. It is probably a move to persuade their allies and other third world countries that this is legitimate, and that the people of these regions actually want to be part of Russia, because the Western leaders are never going to accept it. So it doesn't matter about their opinion. What matters is convincing the other second-rate powers, such as China and India, and a couple of others, to see if you can get them on side. Because there was that famous map of people who sanctioned Russia and people who didn't, and it was just the U.S., Canada, Europe, and Australia and Japan, and the rest continued to trade with Russia mostly for oil and gas as well as wheat exports. So I think we'll see something similar to that map as well, in terms of acceptance of these referendums, which will take place on the 27th for the main regions of Novorossiya that Russia currently has hold over or great sway over. But another thing that recently happened as well was we recently saw a kerfuffle going on in the Caucasus with Armenia and Azerbaijan. And typically what happens between these two is that they typically shell each other in a disputed region called Nagorno-Karabakh over. And there's a lot of history with that region, but what you need to know is they've been fighting over this region for probably 20 to 35 years, right, Praise? Not sure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they had like conflicts diplomatically even before the Soviet Union fell, which then did lead to open violence for a time, like 30 years, yeah.
Yes, so usually all the shelling and stuff happens in that region, which is all entirely in Azerbaijan. But recently, like a week ago or something, Azerbaijan shelled Armenia proper with artillery, and Armenia is a Russian ally, at least Russian sympathetic in terms of its policy, as well as being part of the CSTO organization of nations. And so with this recent happening, because Russia brokered a ceasefire again between them, is that I think we are seeing a power move with the U.S. trying to start something else to get Russia to put more Russian troops off the Ukrainian front and trying to get something going on somewhere else, a second front, essentially. Because Nancy Pelosi recently visited Armenia, and of course, there are some leaders within Armenia that are more sympathetic to the West. And if they switch sides and fully accept U.S. support for weapons, that would be disastrous for Armenia because they are surrounded by enemies. And Iran is one of their only other main allies who supports them currently over Azerbaijan. So that would not go well for Armenia, but I think what we see here is just the West trying to open up a second front. And we also see some other ethnic tension going on in Central Asia in the Fergana Valley as well. What do you think, Praise? Do you think it's a second front by the West, or it's just other peripheral conflicts going on?
Now, do you mean in the Caucasus or in Central Asia?
Both.
Well, I think in Central Asia, I remember seeing a Caspian report video a year ago about potential water wars over, the Fergana Valley between like Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. I think that was a brewing conflict even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And to some extent, Armenia is sort of like a Russia proxy, and Azerbaijan, because it's Muslim, is kind of a Turkey proxy. So in a lot of ways, Russia and Turkey, I think, use these as like proxy tests against each other. And I think in the 2020 conflict, Azerbaijan was mostly successful in that one due to Turkey's drones. And so it could very well be a broader NATO thrust, but I don't think you need to go that far to the top. I mean, we've seen Turkey use them as a proxy before, and it could just be Turkey being kind of its own lone wolf figure.
It could also just be that Armenia is just testing the waters. I forgot what the name of the leader of that country is. I can't remember his name. But he tends to do this when Russia, Armenia's main protector, is focused somewhere else. He tends to start to see what he can kind of get away with. It could also be that as well, but it just seems kind of a coincidence this is happening with this mobilization or around that time. So we'll have to see if anything develops there. But Paul, I wanted you to develop your take on Twitter, which many people had some things to say about your hot take. Can you kind of explain it?
What take in question are you specifically referring to?
The take about Russia losing, globalization being over. That tweet.
Well, these are all, I mean, so that take was based off of 3 factors. It's not impossible that Russia could win this and achieve its primary geopolitical objective, which is secure the Donbass, Novorossiya, and Crimea, and keep itself together through that. That's not an impossibility. It's not likely, but I'd put it probably maybe 35% to 40% likely of happening. 60% would be more likely Russia loses and suffers the consequences of such, of spending all these resources on a war and not winning it. I mean, that's just my opinion. Y'all are entitled to agree with it or disagree with it for whatever reason you believe. Number 2, about China. China's collapsing in real fucking time. Like, if you know, accepting what we hear from happening from China today is true, and it could be wrong, and this could age like milk. But if Xi Jinping was executed by his own government, what that means is basically all of these internal issues we've only heard kind of rumblings about inside of China are coming to the fore. The Yangtze River is currently at an 80-year low. China's been undergoing a historic drought for the past several years. The one child policies and the one China policy actually are kind of coming to a head. The BRI has been a huge waste of resources, and basically China's COVID and all the retarded policies they've put into place with COVID, with locking down entire buildings, entire sections, all this other stuff. If all of that is true, and that isn't just some grand misleading thing from either the West or from all this other stuff, in which case we were all hoodwinked, then China is about to go belly up. All of the different factions within the Chinese Communist Party are basically going to split off into these regional sort of camps that they have, and basically China's going to be out of the game until that resolves itself, if it ever resolves itself. I don't know if we'll go so far as to be a second warlord era, but I don't think it bodes well for China. And then third, globalization is coming to a close if you consider the fact that the United States has been rapidly onshoring as many companies as possible, particularly within the southeastern United States. The United States has been attempting to get as much manufacturing, in terms of automobile manufacturing. Tons of, especially German car companies, have been opening up in South Carolina and Alabama and other places. Steel manufacturing is moving back. All of these, basically these hard material industries, the United States has decided that it's far better to have them in-house, at least based on the changing geopolitical circumstances, than otherwise, which means that the United States, was the entire reason that the globalization economic system happened in the first place, is basically just, demolishing its own economic system at the expense of the rest of the world, and the United States, but to a much lesser degree. So that's what my take was based on. I have reasoning for it. I mean, if I'm wrong on all 3 counts, oh well, but that's why I made that take.
All right, I just want to get your explanation for that. Of course, we had many autists who disagreed with that take. Many contrarians, of course, mostly Eurobros as well.
People disagreeing with a Paul Fahrenheit take? Who would have thought?
Right.
But yeah, it is interesting to see German. Sorry, it is interesting to see German manufacturing drain away out of Europe and go back into the United States. It's very fascinating to watch that happen in real time. It's almost like it's not a coincidence or something, but hey, you know.
Oh, we lost them. But what I was going to say, American populist, is frankly, given how atrociously bad Western media has been at reporting global events since 2001, I have literally no reason to trust anything that they're saying, unless it can be corroborated by independent third parties, whether that's Indian news like WION, Chinese news, Russian news. Al Jazeera seems to be more Western allied now than it used to be. So I don't take any of that seriously anymore. I mean, from WMDs in Iraq to all the crap that led us down the road to the war on terror, the fact that we had the best trained army in Afghanistan and lost it in a week, I don't buy any of that at this point.
What is it that you don't buy specifically? Like what's your issue? Do you think that the new it's entirely propaganda outlets just fabricating stories and they have no kernels of truth based on it? Is that your issue with it?
I think we have a range, right? We have outright fabrications like in recent years in Ukraine, Snake Island, the take on it. I mean, we have footage of troops surrendering boarding Russian naval vessels, which is completely contrary to the statement that we got in the beginning. So that's an outright fabrication. Also, the incubators in the 1991 Iraq War, two events that actually happened, but were heavily colored. So we have a range from completely fabricated, like the Iraqi incubators, to events that were heavily colored. Yes, Saddam at one point had WMDs. He gassed the Kurds in Iran. But, when we got to Iraq, we didn't find any. So as far as China and Russia, I'm not saying that they can't collapse. I mean, clearly Putin is afraid of a collapse. He says as much in his speech for his partial mobilization. And we look at China and their position. But this is what's strange, right? I mean, obviously, for someone like Zion to do this, I can understand why, because Zion sort of is speaking to a certain audience that pays him. But on the DR, on the one hand, we talk about how America is collapsing from within without going through all the stuff that the DR talks about that I've talked about as well. China doesn't seem to have a problem knowing what a woman is. I mean, Russia doesn't have that problem either. And it's like, this isn't the America that invaded Iraq in 2003. This is an America that has exhausted itself in the war on terror. A lot of the competent military personnel are either, many of them are just maimed now. And this is a very different America. If this was the America of 2003, yeah, Russia and China would probably have a really rough time of it. But this is America of 2022. And I don't think that it's a sufficiently relevant comparison.
I don't know. I mean, I can understand your issues with it, and I understand why you've come to that conclusion. I just don't think that the material degradation of the United States is exactly commensurate with its moral degradation. I'm not saying that you're incorrect with that, and I'm not, and the United States definitely does have a lot of weaknesses that it didn't have 20 years ago. As someone who watched Kabul unfold, there was nothing but like fuck ups within the high command. So I completely agree with you on that front. At the same time, it's not like this is the one nail in the coffin of the long decline of empire, because it takes a really long time for empires to die. And honestly, with the performance I think that's happening in Ukraine, which we won't get a complete clear vision from at the other end of it, I think that there still is a lot of fight and a lot of greatest military in the world left in the greatest military in the world until something else comes to replace it. So I'm not rebutting. I'm just disagreeing on certain points.
Yeah. I mean, I understand. We're having different assumptions based on what we've both seen over the last 30 years. But I'm just far more black pill isn't really the right word, but just far more skeptical of the Western reporting. And also, I mean, think about this too. One of the things that got us into the Iraq War in the first place was the connection between Saddam Hussein and the anthrax letters that were being pushed around in 2001, 2002. which it turns out was released from in the United States. That was only figured out after we invaded Iraq. So, I'm just at this point. The other thing that I'll say too is for anybody who's interested, you can watch a series I did with Keith Preston on earlier on my channel where I talked about U.S. military interventions, but specifically dealing with World War I and II, and then now, of course, in Russia. There's a blueprint that's being followed about how the U.S. systematically fabricates things and then creates an incident, which then gets us involved into a broader conflict, which doesn't get us involved in a war. I mean, a good example in more recent years was in Vietnam with first we sent in advisors, then we have the Gulf of Tonkin, and the second incident didn't happen. Yeah, I'm very. I just think there's enough evidence that we shouldn't really give them too much credit.
Yeah, I have a hard time believing anything that comes out of our U.S. intelligence system these days. They've demonstrated many incompetent failures that were obviously false. But I wanted to get into something before we start closing out the stream. I want to lay out my end game for how I think this war will play out, and then I'll let you guys give your opinion on that. So my opinion is the Russian victory. The Russian victory vision would look like capturing all of Donbass, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and with the conditions that Paul brought forth, I don't think Odessa would be taken. Most likely, it would just be those regions, but they would all be fully captured and annexed. That would be the Russian vision of victory currently as things stand. For the Western-backed Ukrainian vision of victory, it would be a stalemate that would bleed Russia dry in terms of money, but also manpower. It would essentially just be the war in Donbass, just going on and on until eventually one side gives from attrition. That's my current take for how the two scenarios would end, but I'll let you guys give your own takes.
All right, so I'm gonna address the comments in the chat here. People are talking about Odessa and the Black Sea. So a couple of things. So there's been a lot of military aid that has gone to Ukraine that is not just on the land side of warfare. There's also the sea side of warfare as well. I know that the Dutch were giving, and among other nations, were giving Harpoon missiles to Ukraine. And I think some other nations like Germany were giving like remote control small craft and other things, etc. So the restoration of naval capability to Ukraine is very important because it means that Ukraine, even if they just have anti-ship cruise missiles, they can keep the Russian Navy from blockading Odessa and keep the Russian Navy from just totally ensuring that no ships can go in and out of Odessa. This is important because Ukraine's economy is primarily based on agriculture, and if you can't export grain overseas, specifically through Odessa, you really can't have an economy. You can't have an effective tax base to buy weapons and keep your military industrial complex running smoothly. So that's a huge thing. So I definitely agree. However, from the perspective of what Russia needs to do, what they need to do, like no shit, okay, this is how we're going to be able to spin a victory, and is to make sure that the Donbass and Zaporozhye and Crimea regions are all secured by Russia. That's my condition for victory. That's a territorial gain. You can easily spin that as a W, right? You're still taking territory. You're still making sure that you have, 25% or 30% of Ukrainian territory at the start of the war, which is kind of, important. And all of the areas which are the most heavily pro-Russian prior to the conflict. So that's a huge victory for them. That would be my very low bar for victory. The preference obviously has, as I've always said, this is to take Odessa and to take everything east of the Dnieper. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think everything north of Kharkov is going to be taken, and any further Russian territory or Ukrainian territory that's going to be taken by Russia is going to be let me rephrase. Any further Russian territory or Ukrainian territory that's taken by Russia is going to be dependent on defeat of the Ukrainian army in the field. So that's my minimum win condition and medium win condition for Russia.
Okay. I think that for Russia, depending on how narrowly we want to define this, officially Russia's win condition is the Donbass region and the Lugansk region being liberated. But they've already taken more territory than that, and they're already planning to incorporate that territory into Russia. So clearly, beyond the official stated limits, there was more. Now the question is, how much more? While the West would say the entire country, I don't think so. Many of us thought it was the eastern half of the country, which, whether that was the case or not, seems increasingly unlikely. I think that minimally speaking, we could say that the Donbass would be a victory condition for Russia from its technical statements, though maybe not from its actions. Now, that's also not to say that this couldn't be the second bear trap. I mean, that's certainly what people in the West are hoping it would be. And I would say, I guess, in favor of Paul's thoughts, Russia has known for some pretty serious snafus, the 1939-40 Finnish Winter War, the invasion of Afghanistan, Grozny in the First Chechen War. But I think this is where it gets a little tricky, right? Because if somebody was going to make a prediction about what Russia would do in World War II, by looking at World War I, they would have predicted a German victory, and most people did. But there were certain sufficiently different conditions that such a prediction, though sensible in one sense, was not sensible in another. And I think because Russia here, unlike in Afghanistan, where the conflict was more or less peripheral to the Soviet Union collapsed at its defeat, but it wasn't perceived as essential to the survival of Russia. Putin believes that defeat in Ukraine could lead to the fragmentation of the Russian Federation, in which case, I think from the Russian point of view, they're in this no matter what. And so I think that would militate against the sort of Afghan turnout for Russia. That doesn't necessarily mean that a victory for them would be easy. It could be a Pyrrhic victory. It could be where they lose 500,000 men in the process, in which case Russia can't do much more. But those are my thoughts.
Yeah, the other reason why Odessa is important is what's that region next to Odessa that slips my mind right now?
Transnistria.
Transnistria, that region in Moldova, right? So the reason why Odessa is important is because it sets up a win condition for other regions for additional territorial gain and another possibility of extracting territory from Ukraine in the future. So that's the reason why Odessa is important, is because if you take Odessa, then you can use Transnistria as a further stepstone to more territory.
Paul, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I guess my takes have already been said. I'll just kind of restate them. I don't think Russia can achieve its tertiary objective. It's very unlikely it'll achieve its secondary objective, and I'd give it probably 40% to 35% odds of achieving its primary objective of the Donbass, which is something to get something out of this whole war, this exercise. Otherwise, I think any material loss that the U.S. and Europe will undergo for certain can take it better than Russia can. Because keep in mind, Russia is still a country coming out of the 1990s, which is an absolute terrible era for the country, and from the early 2000s recovery, it seems it's still not enough to fight a massive conventional war. So I'm not going to hold my breath for a Russian victory, but it is within the realm of possibility. So that's kind of my take.
Okay, yeah, I think so as well. At least the tertiary has to be achieved, because if Russia is totally defeated, Putin is gone. he will be, of course, killed in his dacha, so to say. One way or another, he will be removed. And like Praise mentioned, this isn't a tertiary fight like Afghanistan or Finland. This is like for centuries, like part of Russia proper, and inhabited by ethnic Russians, at least in the two oblasts, which started this whole thing in the first place in 2014. And abandoning that is a loss condition for Putin that would be fatal for him ultimately. Probably not for Russia itself yet. But that's my closing thoughts on that. So, gentlemen, do you have anything you'd like to show before I kind of close out the stream? We'll go right from left.
Yeah, sure. Definitely check out my channel, Praise of Folly Podcast. Follow me on Twitter. I'll update content for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And you can also follow video updates there as well. So for this coming week, on Monday, I'm going to do an episode on what it means to be a man. On Tuesday, the machine is hermaphrodite. Thursday, Logos and I are going to be going through Justin the Martyr's First Apology, chapters 31 to 40. And then on Thursday, I'm going to be covering Helm's Deep as a technical analysis.
You can follow me on Twitter at CavKingPaul. You can find me on Telegram. My Telegram channel is Hotel Fahrenheit. That's FAHRENHEIDT. And you can read my Substack, Paul Fahrenheit, spelled the same way, .substack.com. And that's all my stuff.
All right. You can follow me on Twitter at EdgyMandrill. And I also have Gab, and I also have a YouTube account, which I'm currently in the process of uploading my Substack articles into audio recorded, edited videos. And I just uploaded a video on the symbology of the recent Dune movie and an analysis of what it means.
For this week, Wednesday, I have Red Hawk on to discuss the Red Pill for Zoomers, and I have an interview with Paul discussing foreign policy and the current situation that will premiere later this week. But with that being said, thank you, fine gentlemen, for joining me, having this conversation. And remember, guys, the light can't last forever. Keep your heads up.